What's happening, guys? In this episode of the Silver Screen 5, we're going to start getting to know a little bit more about who I am from the movies that I have loved throughout my life. So let's get started with a great year, the year I really began remembering having a fond love for movies, 1984. Coming in at number 5, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. This film blew me away at the age of 7. The international adventure this film delivered opened my eyes to other countries and cultures. It created so many awesome settings for a film to take place in. Indiana Jones was the first film hero I really remember seeing as a kid, and this was the first film of the franchise that I saw. Learning there was a Raiders of the Lost Ark from 1981 was like Christmas, and I can't even count the times that I rented both of these VHS copies from the video store in the little town I grew up in. And despite the years past, I may not still go out into the woods and have fake shootouts and sword fights, but watching Harrison Ford capture the feeling of a true film hero will never get old. He shows charisma and charm in his performance as the whip-slinging archaeologist, and this is a classic film that will go down as one of the all-time great sequels, with the ambition and creativity still shining bright, making this one of my all-time favorite movies. Coming in at number 4, The Terminator. This was the film that introduced me to Arnold Schwarzenegger and opened my eyes to the world of science fiction. The special effects blew me away as a kid and completely pulled me into the world of this movie. Schwarzenegger was awesome in this film, and his performance as the Terminator is rightfully one of his iconic roles. This was just an action-packed movie filled with tons of memorable catchphrases, cutting-edge CGI at the time, and loads of creativity that still translates when watching today. As a kid growing up, the imposing musical score and the robotic persona of Arnold instilled true intimidation, and even after all these years, the action sequences are still well shot, they deliver the intended impact, and while it may not have been as good as Terminator 2 Judgment Day, it is still a classic film from the decade. Coming in at number 3, Nightmare on Elm Street. This was the first real horror movie I remember seeing as a kid. A friend of mine had some parents who loved films. They had a massive collection of VHS tapes, and with plenty of time there alone, we watched a lot of films we probably shouldn't have. This horror film definitely being one of them. Watching this film, I can remember being both terrified and completely captivated by the creative dream world this franchise would create, along with the help of one of the iconic characters in the genre in Freddy Krueger. This film just scared the hell out of me as a kid. It was the first movie I watched that took me to another world with this unique creativity. Robert Englund was fantastic and charming as Freddy Krueger. He had me peeking around corners as a kid, yet I always loved watching him and his bladed glove haunt this group of high school students led by a young Johnny Depp. The practical effects in this film still hold up today, and the effort and realism can still be appreciated after all these years, making this the best horror movie of not only 1984, but possibly of the whole decade. Number 2, The Karate Kid. There probably weren't many guys my age that didn't imagine being Ralph Macchio when this film came out. It was a true underdog story filled with a touching family dynamic, a come-from-behind kid that no one counted on, a story of young love. You name it, this movie delivered it. Macchio and the great Pat Morita were both excellent in their roles, and they deliver some heartwarming chemistry, and I can't even count the countless hours I spent practicing my own crane kick in my karate pajamas that I never wanted to take off. This was a great film that was highly inspirational, filled with much more substance than I expected after watching it all these years later. The writing of the story was detailed to properly develop and make you care about these characters. There are a handful of memorable scenes and lines that will go down in 80s cinema history. I loved this movie as a kid, and I can definitely still appreciate it as the grown-up kid I am today. Now, before we get into my number 1, let's cover some honorable mentions. Bachelor Party. Admittedly, this wasn't one of the best films of the year by any means, but it was the movie that showed me my first set of boobies. Something that was pretty awesome as a kid, and this rom-com may not have been meant for young eyes, but where there's a will, there's a way, and this movie was routinely snuck in while the grown-ups were away. The sexual references in this movie were way over my head at the time, but it introduced me to the world of full frontal nudity and Tom Hanks, and that's why this is one of the memorable films of the year for me. Police Academy. Again, another film that may not have blown away the box office, won tons of awards, but this film boasts loads of slapstick humor that I just couldn't get enough of as a kid, in addition to a collection of characters that were as cartoonish as imaginable, and the result was a fun comedy that I remember watching countless times, and it didn't hurt that the lighthearted tone of this film masked loads of sexual innuendo and adult humor that I shouldn't have, but definitely did enjoy as a kid. Red Dawn. I loved this movie growing up as a kid, and it does still hold up today with some classic performances by the at the time young cast. At my age of this movie, the threat of something like the events depicted in this movie happening felt quite possible, and it added to an ominous vibe of this classic film. I spent many hours in the woods growing up around my house, imagining I was a member of the Wolverines, and this will always be one of the classic movies to me. Beverly Hills Cop. While this did turn out to be one of the great films of the year, it didn't quite make my list. I remember seeing the second film prior to this original, but I definitely loved the action and comedy they both delivered. Eddie Murphy was great in this movie, proved he could be the leading man, and with tons of laughs, great 80s era shootouts, and a classic soundtrack, this film is still fun years later. Gremlins. Now, it was painstaking to make the decision to not put this movie in my top 5, but with so many other classics from the year that I loved, it just barely missed the cut. Regardless, I loved this movie as a kid. The practical effects and creativity shine in this film. It's one of the titles on my yearly Christmas movie list, and it just never gets old. The Gremlins was a classic from the decade, and with the wild adventure the story follows, it's still fun to sit back and enjoy today. And with that said, let's finally get into my number 1 film of 1984, Ghostbusters. This was easily my favorite film of the year. I watched this movie countless times growing up, played with all the toys, the comic books, watched the cartoons, ran around the house chasing imaginary ghosts, and I wanted to be a Ghostbuster. The cast of Murray, Ramis, Hudson, and Aykroyd were iconic in their performances, and the comedy still holds up today. The special effects were amazing for the time, and despite all the advances of today, the blend of practical and computer effects are still fun to sit back and watch despite all the years past. Slimer and the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man were some of my favorite characters as a kid, and the lighthearted feel of this movie blended perfectly with the comedy, the settings, the musical score, plot, and cast. The writing was able to blend a ghost story with strong comedic overtones, and the performances from the cast are what make this movie so great. And that's my list of favorite films from 1984, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I definitely hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments below some of your favorite films from the year. As always, I'm Anthony. This is the Silver Screen Analysis, and I'll catch you guys at the movies.